Alright, hello everyone. Firstly, obviously, opinions expressed don't represent my employer or Cisco. Cisco may be a little upset about a few things, so I'm Darren. I'm a full-time cat caretaker and a pen tester at a company called Cybermax. All the material from this talk will be on the fullspectrum.dev website just after the talk, or actually maybe slightly before, scheduled posting and all that. There's a question I've had for a while. It's like, what makes the best exploit? And it's like, you want it to be remote, you want no authentication requirements, you want privileged code execution, so like root or admin, and ideally you want to get stuff like persistence for free, and it's even better if the bug is unpatchable, right? Well, Cisco dropped one of these lovely, absolute Chad tier, S tier bugs in our lap with, it's got a CVSS of 10. I actually don't know how CVSS works, but when I ticked the ticky boxes, it came out to a 10. So Cisco announced that there's this bug in some of their end-of-life ATA devices, the SPA series, that permits a remote, unauthenticated user to just remotely fucking overwrite the firmware and, like, gain persistent code execution forever. And they're like, yeah, the product's end-of-life, we're not fixing this. And I was like, that sounds great. So, but like, there's no patch to diff. So to go, and this talks about the process of like reverse engineering it and writing an exploit for the thing and like making all the nice things happen. And I want to, I was like, okay, cool. We've got like an exploit that gives us like living forever inside people's networks, where their only mitigation is to unplug the device and chuck it in the bin, which annoys me a bit. This was the advisory. It was, they're like, oh, blah, blah, blah. Unauthenticated remote attacker could execute arbitrary code, which I think is the understatement of the year, because what they actually mean is they can overwrite the firmware of the device and just, like, become the device. You are God now. And they were like, oh, it's a missing authentication check in the firmware update process. And I was like, right, okay, cool. That tells me a little bit. And the Cisco were like, oh, this has not been exploited in the wild. Don't worry, it's fine. Please upgrade to our device, which is going to be end-of-life next year. So, buy more shit to deal with the old shit, and then presumably next year they'll have a new little box that, like, you have to buy to replace the box that just went out of support. So, I love these end-of-life products things, because they're great. Like, it's like, oh, there's no fix. And I went and looked on the internet. There is about 6,500 of these exposed publicly to the internet. These are more common inside networks. Like, you'll find some networks that I've done testing on, you'll find like dozens of these, one on every desk, but sometimes some idiot like lets one through the firewall and out exposed. So if there's 6,000 exposed to the internet, I estimate there's probably like 10, 20 times more, like, deployed everywhere, probably 100 times more. These are quite popular devices. So to come up with a plan, like, what was I going to do when I read this advisory and I was like, I want to do something with this. And I was like, so I have to find the firmware, I'm going to have to reverse engineer the firmware, I'm going to have to find the bug, I'm going to have to build some kind of backdoor for the thing, I'm going to have to build a firmware image with the backdoor to put on the device, and then I'm going to make the whole Rube Goldberg machine of shit work so that I get code execution. And then you can't get rid of me off the device. I'll be able to live forever on the device because I can do nasty things like patch out the firmware update function, so you can't just update to a known good. It's perma-fucked. So finding the firmware, this was weird. So one of the problems at Cisco is Cisco are really, really crap at, like, letting you download firmware for stuff, but for some reason, this device's firmware I was able to actually pull from their website at the time that I was writing this. So it mightn't be there, like, next week, because Cisco tend to delete crap off their website that they don't support anymore, and a lot of their stuff is behind a login wall, so if you do have a Cisco login and you can download firmware for stuff, just start downloading and upload to archive.org. I won't tell you. But please do, please start archiving this stuff, because they do tend to delete it, which makes vulnerability research on it really hard. So unpacking the firmware, it was less hard than I thought. So Binwalk kind of did an okay job. I did have a screenshot for this, but it was completely fucking unreadable. It's just a wall of text. but like binwalk with the -m and -e arguments was able to extract some of it, and then I had to use like Sasquatch to unpack the squash fs file. I was hoping to use a tool called Backhand for that, but it didn't support the like custom squash fs they used at the time. Unblob actually works better than binwalk for this, but you know. So the firmware structure, it turns out, was documented by a nice person called Big Nerd 95 a few years ago. I had the pleasure of meeting them a few years ago at a conference. They're an absolute genius. They were hoping to get OpenWRT onto a related device. So they had they'd like, you know, done a bunch of reverse engineering work on it, documenting like the weird firmware structure in the header, which saved me a shitload of time because I was sitting there going, "Oh God." So they'd done reverse engineering the SPA232D, which is a related device that looks almost fucking identical. I found that their work also applied to the 112 and 122, which were the 112 is the one the advisory was for, and they all use kind of similar, same-ish, samey firmware. So they released a tool called Patent Image Editor, which allows you to write patches for the firmware, like you can unpack it and repack it with stuff, which saved me a shitload of time. So the firmware structure is, it's got like a header, and then you've got module headers, and then you've got module data, and the only important bit really is the header bit. The rest just like, you can kind of cobble together by like catting files together. So the firmware header bit has this firmware magic string at the start, which becomes a little bit interesting in a bit, and the only real check it has is an MD5 sum of the header and the module headers. So there's no like code signing, there's no like integrity checking beyond MD5 being used to like make sure the data isn't corrupted. So the obvious thing was to go buy some stuff. So I just went to Fleabay, and 50 quid later, a device landed, and then another 50 quid, another device landed. You know how it goes. You end up with a bunch of garbage. My original plan was to start taking apart the device to find if there's like a UART header or something, which I kind of started doing and then kind of forgot because I ended up just writing the fucking exploit and owning the thing before I could finish like doing all the documentation of that. But you can see this is some of you may be familiar with this device, this contraption. What it's for is it sits on your desk and you plug a shitty plain old telephone into it, and it turns it into a VoIP-capable desk phone. And this is the 112, just like what's inside it. There is kind of a over on the far side of it, there is kind of 4 pins that I think might be UART, but I haven't actually checked yet, because I got distracted. And then you've a couple of ports. Like on the 112, you've one Ethernet port, you power, you have phone 1, phone 2, and there's an empty slot on the board, which I'll actually just go back to. There's like an empty space where you could put another Ethernet in, which is interesting because on the 232D, you have 2 Ethernet ports. So like they're reusing the same everything, same bill of materials. The 232D is kind of interesting because it also does DECT for like the cordless handsets. So it's got like a bunch of radio gubbins inside. That I haven't gotten around to playing with yet. So like, there's possibly radio fun. There's a thing that looks like UART. So the 232D and the 122 have 2 Ethernet ports because it not only acts as a phone to SIP VoIP converter, but it also acts as a router. So you plug your workstation into one end, and the other end goes into like the WAN port on your cable modem or whatever, or So it sits in the middle between a user's workstation and the internet, which gets quite interesting in a little bit. So what happened next was, like, I had the firmware unpacked, and I had some devices, and I had an idea that that there's this vulnerability that exists, and I knew that it was going to be the web server. So after, like, just kind of staring at it for a while, I knew it was going to be something in the HTTP binary. So we started looking at that, and originally I was going to post a load of decompiler screenshots, but nobody could fucking read them, so, yeah. So the process of reverse engineering this was pretty much the same as anyone who's, fucked around with binary reverse engineering knows. It's like, you look for some stuff, you like search for strings, you do your cross-reference thingy, you hit the decompile button, you stare at it, you go, this tells me absolutely nothing. You curl up in a little ball in the corner and cry for a while, then you go back and you hit the decompile button again, and, you go around in circles, and eventually you see the thing you're looking for. So what we actually learned from staring at the web server binary was a bunch of stuff. So it has this authentication checking function, which doesn't actually get called all the time for all the endpoints. So all the CGI endpoints are like in a big, big load of code, and only some of them actually call the auth check. So, and it's a auth check, and the upgrade function, interestingly, the one that's like /upgrade.cgi, doesn't actually ever call the authentication check. It does call to see if the request is coming from the WAN port or the LAN port, but that call doesn't actually do anything because it's not actually checking the auth. So I figured at this point it was like we could just see what happens when we do the firmware upgrade. So got out burp, did an upgrade with the legitimate firmware file, and started looking at all the parameters in the post request, and I was like, so we've got a session ID in the get, a session ID in the refer, and a session ID post parameter, and a bunch of other shit that doesn't really matter. And then there's the firmware file as like a file. And I was like, will the stupidest fucking thing work? Well, it turns out if you just delete all those authorization headers and parameters, it just fucking lets it go through anyway. It's like, it doesn't matter. So you end up, it just works. So that was exciting. So to backdoor the firmware image, what we do is we carve out the squashfs thing from the firmware blob, and then unpack the squashfs file, add a ARMv4 like telnetd or like tiny shell or your backdoor choice in, just add a call to it from an init script, add, whatever tools you want on the box at the same time, like if you want TCP dump, if you want a debugger or whatever, just put them in, and then repack the squashfs file back up, which there are tools for because Cisco had to release the source for their modified version of squashfs because of the GPL and stuff. So you can actually get like the correct packer to recompress it directly from like Cisco upload to fucking SourceForge or something. And then you use a modified version of Payton Image Editor to rebuild the firmware image, gluing the headers back on, like concatenating the thing. I've written a lengthy blog post about this because it doesn't really translate well into slides, like showing all the steps. So the question is, does it work? So I wrote a Python script that uploads an arbitrary firmware blob to the device without auth, and it's got there's this awkward moment where when you run the script, the device has to reboot, and you wait like 2 minutes going, fuck, have I bricked it? Have I just made and yes, it does work. You get a root shell on the device that persists across reboots, and it even persists across hitting the factory reset pin on the back. And also a thing I noticed was it doesn't break the configuration of the device. The device config is stored in NVRAM, and when you reflash the device, it pulls the config back out of the NVRAM, so you won't cause an interruption of service beyond 2 minutes where the device is just rebooting and reflashing itself. Well, I was like, okay, so it affects the 112, which is what Cisco said. Cisco were like, this only really affects the 112. And I was like, Cisco fucking lie? Oh look, it works on the 122 as well. One they didn't admit it was affected. And, oh look, also the 232 is affected. It's like, come on guys, it's not hard. Cisco surely know where they've put their shitty software in all their products. They surely know where, it shouldn't be up to somebody like me to go buy a bunch of their crap and take it apart to figure out which ones are affected or not. This is something they should be capable of doing in-house, but apparently no. So I stopped after 3 because I live in a house with another person and they get really pissy if I started having stacks and stacks and stacks of Cisco garbage filling up the whole house. 3 or 4 was bad enough, but beyond that, it might have caused problems. But a thing I noticed was Cisco, they reuse code all over the shop, and I got a hold of firmware for the WRP500 and the SPA 8000, and they kind of look really similar. I haven't put enough time in yet, they use slightly different things. Like, one of them uses JFFS2 for the file system, says SquashFS, but all the crap in it looks the same. Different but the same. But when I was reversing the upgrade function, I noticed this. So, in the upgrade function, it's got this, like, check for the magic at the start of the firmware image, and the magic varies across devices because some of them helpfully they've all got this weird, like, upper lowercase firmware, or whatever. But some of them, like, we now know that the SRP 520, 540, the whatever the fuck a VS510W is, they all use the same upgrade binary, which means they're vulnerable. I just have to, go get one and, like, get firmware images for them to prove it. But, like, these are just the ones they admit to. These are just the ones that, you can tell are affected by, like, looking in the code of one that, like, it's reused in others. But there's an untold number of other devices which use this patent firmware thing, use the same patent firmware updater, which is garbage and doesn't check for authentication. So, it could affect, like, dozens or hundreds of devices. So I went and checked. The SRP 520 is end of life, end of support, and more than likely vulnerable, but I can't really be bothered buying one yet. The 540, yep, fuck it, just throw that in the bin as well. And next we get on, the next part is about payload selection. So, spawning a telnet shell on the device is nice and all, but it's kind of useless in, like, real-world, hacking. So, the criteria I had was the connection needs to be encrypted, because, if you're using this live, you don't want to expose your customers' data, blah, blah, blah. It needs to be either... So, like, then there's the question of, like, how you want your thing to connect back to you, or do you want to connect to it? And that depends on network position, network topology. And then there's the features you want. Generally, I want, like, a fully functional shell, so if I hit Control-C, I don't lose my shell on the box, because that's embarrassing. But I also like stuff like file transfer and SOX proxies, because if this device is at a network edge, you can pivot in and start fucking with Active Directory and stuff. But the big one is, can you cross-compile it for ARM? And that's where I lost several weekends and many nights. And the other limitations are, these devices are, like, the CPU is trash, they've got fuck all RAM, they've got bugger all storage, it has to be statically linked for ARM, and because they have so little storage, you can't, like, use tools written in Go or Rust because the binaries are so big that you don't have the flash space for them. So it has to be stuff written in C. And then there's your connectivity constraints. So if the device is at the network edge, you can use stuff like a bind shell or port knocking, and that's kind of ideal. Otherwise, you need something that beacons out, and that's more common, is that, it's going to be device behind NAT, where you don't have a direct thing to it. So I made this terrible diagram which shows, like, the connectivity with the 112. So with the 112, your shell will live somewhere there where you're adjacent to user workstations. Whereas with the 122 and 232, you will actually be upstream of users' workstations, which becomes quite interesting. Because if you're network adjacent, you're not the asshole in the middle, you're on the side, so you're not going to be upstream. So, like, you're going to have to do spoofing and stuff to do, like, packet sniffing. Whereas, if you're in the upstream position with, say, if you're on the 122 or the 232D, you are in between user workstations and the internet, so you can just sit there and sniff traffic. And you can probably also sniff, like, the phone calls and stuff. So, after considerable pain, I managed to cross-compile TCP dump for the fucking thing, get it working, so I could do upstream sniffing. And I did have a demo for this, but it didn't work properly, so I'm going to post it next week. But what you can do is you can write a script that lives on the device that will sniff traffic, upload it to your C2 on a loop, so you basically have a wiretap, which I think is pretty fucking cool. Like, you're wiretapping their phones and their workstations at the same time, forever. So when it came down to, like, the backdoor thing, I ended up using Crash by a guy called Stealth, and it offers all the features you want. It's written in C, it compiles really small, it's really nice, it's super awesome. The problem is that it relies on OpenSSL, and if anybody here has ever tried cross-compile stuff that uses OpenSSL, they will know the pain and suffering. ended up getting that working, so you end up with a persistent connect back shell that gives you the ability to do SOX proxying and pivoting, etc. I also ended up putting together a simple beacon in C with curl. This was a terrible idea, but I actually got GPT to write a bunch of the code. I actually need to publish that next week because it's on a machine at home. All simple beacon for the Cisco SPA does is it can either run commands, it can like launch crash with a config file, or it can like dump the NVRAM and upload it, because the NVRAM stuff is kind of interesting. It was somebody from CUTEL that I talked to on Twitter a while back mentioned that the SIP credentials, like the device stores SIP credentials for like whatever outbound SIP thing it uses. And there's the possibility, if I can figure out a way, because I know where the SIP credentials live, they're just in this obfuscated blob of crap that I haven't figured out what it is yet. And they do persist across flashing. So when I exploit the device, it doesn't delete the SIP credentials. If I can figure out how to get the SIP credentials back out of the device, it means you can do all sorts of stuff with, like, there's potential impact with telephony fraud, like, you know, ringing, you know, 1-800 premium rate lines off the device and stuff. So there's interesting considerations there with regards the fraud potential. And the other thing, this is one of the worst ideas I've had, was, so these devices do a lot of outbound SIP traffic, and I was like, I had this thought the other day, and I was like, can we do command and control over a SIP call? And that's a problem for somebody else. I'm leaving that intrusive thought to somebody in this room will go and do it, I guess, because you've got, like, the workstation talks to the device talks out to something over SIP, you could probably have the device do command and control over a SIP call, and that'd be completely undetectable. I mean, it's a reasonable thing to do, right? I don't think I'm going to bother doing that personally. That's somebody else's problem. I do need help. I wrote some Yara rules that detect the firmware magic, and if anybody's got like a giant archive of Cisco firmware images somewhere, please give it to me, or I will just give you the Yara rule to run, and it will detect images that have like the stupid patent firmware header, and then those are like good targets for writing more exploits for this. I'm currently trying to download an archive.org. Somebody uploaded an archive like 150 gigs of Cisco firmwares for random crap, so I've that downloading, but it's, you know, downloading at like snail's pace. Seriously though, if you have firmware for SPA, ATA, any of these Cisco things, give it to me. I will give you a handcrafted backdoored firmware image so you can have fun with it. I will, you know, I require data. Now, the problem with this is, and this is where I complain a little bit, is I see a problem here. And it's not just a security problem, it's this shit. So here's the thing, right? We make these devices and put a end of support date on them that is pretty short dated, and then we ship them to people, and we expect them to just throw them out. Where do they end up? They end up somewhere else. And it's our responsibility to, I think, to make these devices useful beyond what their vendors' end of support date is, because, I mean, it's not, you know, other vendors also are saying the same thing, like with the recent Barracuda vault, and they were like, oh, just throw out the appliance, we will ship you a new one. And I'm like, well, where does it go? You know, it's like, we make so much garbage and put it out. You know, once it's got an unfixable security bug, we're like, oh, just chuck it in the skip. It's like, it's not the most socially responsible thing to do, so I think that, you know, we should, as people who do security stuff, maybe consider this a little bit. Instead of going, chuck that old tin in the, you know, maybe repurpose it, find a new home for it. Yeah, that number, by the way, that's gone up. But, yeah. So, yeah, that's pretty much it. If anybody has questions, I don't know if we can.
Were you tempted at all to see if you could patch the one? Stick the firmware out there?
So I do have a patched one, but the problem is, I was going to cover patching it, but the patch I've written for it breaks firmware updates forever. It's kind of like the hit it with a hammer approach to patching. I just removed the firmware update function. So the problem is that yes, it fixes the vulnerability, but it also prevents you from ever updating it again.
I was also wondering how Cisco and their lawyers would think about you releasing modified versions of their software as well.
I mean, they can come sue me. They can try. I'd enjoy it.
How bad generally do you see vendors are with kind of signing firmware, devices, things?
Very few vendors actually sign their firmware in my experience. So some, it's like some sign, some do signing, and then the question is like, are the signatures checked? So the other problem is that forcing signed updates is also user hostile in a way, because it prevents you from doing stuff like loading OpenWRT or something onto the device. So you've got kind of a, it's like, yes, they should sign their firmware, but also that'll screw people over who are trying to run free software on it. So, Yeah.
Two questions. First one is, as you found that the code was operating on other Cisco devices that are not publicly disclosed, did you try approaching Cisco to say, you've got the same problem on this?
Absolutely not. They're not a paying customer. Fuck them.
Second question is, so the analog phone that's plugged in, this box does analog to SIP conversion. So your routine where you cross-compile things to be done, that would upload sort of here's the last 5 minutes, here's the last 5 minutes. That would also cover all the SIP call conversations.
Yeah.
So everything the user said
is now on
your TCP now.
Yeah. So I get everything they said, if they accidentally leave the phone off the hook for a bit.
Or they're paying their bank account via a debit card, so
yeah.
Card numbers, okay.
You get everything, it's wonderful. Yeah.
It was all blew up when BT got rid of the PSTN network.
Wait, what? They're going to do away with their phones?
They're all going to SIP in about a year's time, 18 months' time.
Oh, God.
Analog phones are supposed to be totally gone.
That's not going to go horribly wrong at all. Oh, I didn't actually know that.
It's a public state, and certainly my company's working towards whatever we can do with that.
Oof.
But that's across home users as well. So your home phone will plug into your home hub or whatever they want to call it, or whatever your provider is. So there'll be no more analog plastic, of course, in the UK.
Oh, I didn't. So, oh God, they're going to have to. I mean, SIP is a nightmare to secure, so.
He does. Literally.
Well, I'm not sure how many people actually use SIP with it. Virgin Media trumped their phone years over their kind of cable. So, it's just kind of the core network of PSTN is shut down. So it'll probably just be over reach or something.
I didn't know that. I haven't lived in the UK for a few years, so.
My OpenReach hub thing, I got my fiber thing. It's got a phone call at the back, so I can plug the phone into it.
So it does old analog to SIP.
It's supposed to support it, yes, if I took that service from OpenReach from BT.
Oh dear.
People are using mobile phones, but I don't even have a line at home myself.
I've got, I know we have a phone line somewhere in the house, but, I wouldn't know where it is.
I don't see it being a massive problem unless it's old people. They will die anyways.
Yep.
The public-facing ATAs, do you have a feel for, is that industrial applications, or why are people putting
So
that's one of the public-facing side of things?
I haven't gone and figured out who's running them yet. I downloaded a list of all the hosts with them exposed, but I haven't done analysis yet on who's exposing it. But I've a sneaking suspicion it's going to be random small medium enterprises are just going to accidentally have these things port forwarded.
So a reason that might be is there's quite a bit of problem with telephony in terms of it not quite working sometimes. It has to go through a NAT gateway, and that messes up the SIP protocol because it doesn't know where it is and has to use other services because it will either proxy it and bounce it off a COTAN server, or it has to do things like reach out and find out what NAT address it has, and they haven't set that up correctly, or they can't.
They'll just put it through.
Just statically map it onto the internet and fix that. Yeah. I think that can change the
So I guess it's blame the SIP protocol engineers again.
No, blame NAT. NAT is the cool solution to all of problems.
So we should be doing IPv6 then?
Definitely.
Fair.
You mentioned that there was some validation around whether the updates coming over the WAN interface or the total one work.
Yeah, so there's a function that checks, and there's a config option for like restrict updates to only LAN side, but it doesn't actually do anything. Like I found there is a function that checks like which interface it's coming from, but it doesn't affect anything. It doesn't actually work. Well, actually, sorry, I'll rephrase that. It only works if you're logging in and uploading the firmware authenticated properly. If you delete the fucking authorization headers, that function never gets called. Somebody make that make sense. Yeah.
Why does it have a WAN site? Isn't it just a trunker phone dial tone that's directly over SIP on a local network?
So they also function as routers because Cisco figured you could make 2 pieces of garbage inside 1 piece of hardware.
Naturally.
You could get twice as much bad news for like
10 times more.
Yeah.
I wonder if people like daisy chain them into kind of like a network, so then if you compromise one, you get 6. Or one phone back.
So surely a slightly more serious version of that idea is that you have much remote workers and you basically use them as VPN appliances. So you say from home, I have my laptop, I have a phone, but possibly impact the network. These, I would guess,
maybe? I mean, I didn't see any VPN stuff on them. So, like, maybe you have to pay an extra support fee for that.
Well, guys, we've got a couple of minutes until the next talk, which is detecting network beaconing on convolutional networks with zeros. Awesome. Thanks very much.
Thank you.